North Road made this.
Hello, I'm David Okeode, principal instructor at Kavis Cloud, 4 times Microsoft MVP, and author of multiple books on cloud security. I would like to speak with you about our courses at Kavis Cloud. First, we are cloud security focused. We maintain an unbiased stance towards vendors, and we cut through all the typical marketing jargon in many trainings out there. We help you to understand things as they really are. The second thing that's unique about our courses is that we are multi-cloud focused. Our multi-cloud security courses covers the top 3 public cloud platforms out there: AWS, Azure, and GCP. Our instructors are not just trainers, they are seasoned professionals with real-world experience. The third reason is that our training modules are designed to provide practical hands-on experience. Our courses are packed full of hands-on labs that you find engaging and interesting. And finally, our prices are the best out there. I encourage you to check out our upcoming courses on our website and also testimonials from our students. See you soon at www.kaviscloud.com. Hello everyone, hello. Hello and welcome to today's study session. So this is the Microsoft Azure Security Study Series. Started this about 2 weeks ago. So where we've just been going through some conversations around what I call the 4 key pillars of cloud security. That is talking about identity, network and infrastructure, application, and data. We're going to be looking at those 4 aspects as it concerns securing workloads in Azure and even the cloud platform itself. So if you're yet to, I would highly recommend that you follow the Meetup group so you can be notified of upcoming sessions that we've put together. So I'll share the link in the chat on the chat window. And also, as we go through like this series, if there's any specific aspects that you want me to touch on, that you want me to cover, feel free to reach out to me. Drop me a message. I'll review the message and I'll respond to it. So let's get started with today's study session. So we're going to pick things up from where we stopped the last time. So the last time we stopped in our conversation, we stopped when we're looking at just password protection, which is part of identity security. So we're looking at identity security uh, being the foundation, being the core of securing cloud platforms and cloud workloads. Then we also mentioned that um, there are many areas that we need to look into. Part of that was password protection. So we talked about password protection capabilities of Entra ID being the feature that allows us to. It's not just about blocking um, passwords that don't adhere to a policy. There are passwords that may adhere to a policy, but they're still considered to be weak passwords. So in those cases, password protection can help us. We can define a globally banned password list on top of Microsoft's own list of passwords, common passwords that are banned. So we combine both together to ensure that those weak passwords are not used in our environment for authentication. But we also mentioned that there's a way for us to integrate this on premises. And if you remember from last week, I showed you how we need to set up a server on premises. We need to have the agents deployed there. And the agent sort of acts as a proxy between our on-premises domain controller and Entra ID, which is the cloud. And it's going to download the list of these banned passwords. It's going to download the list locally so that any password set, password reset operations on premises goes through the same assessment. So that was what we saw last week. So, but today we're going to pick things up from there. We're going to be looking at other security capabilities that we can use in Entra ID. Today we're going to be looking at conditional access. Now, conditional access is one that has been around for a very long time. It's popular like this, very, very popular these days in terms of how many organizations do things. If you're going to be using conditional access, you need to be on a minimum of Entra ID P1. So that's the minimum license that you need to have if you're going to be using conditional access. But let's have a look at what the authentication flow looks like without conditional access. So without conditional access, this is what the authentication flow looks like. You have a user that's using a client. That could be a web client, that could be their PC, or it could be a desktop client, whatever. They have a client that they want to use that client to access an application. So the client makes the request to the application, which redirects the user to Entra ID for authentication. As we spoke about previously in this study series, Entra ID is going to validate the password. Entra ID is also going to do the MFA verification or any other form of verification that you've configured, which we discussed again past few weeks. Is going to do that validation. And then once it's completed that validation, it's going to return an access token and a refresh token. We'll talk about these tokens later. So we'll talk about them later in this series. So it's going to return an access token and a refresh token. Again, we'll talk about them later, but what you need to know for now is that the access token is the actual token that will be used to get access to the application. So that's what the application will be validating. The refresh token, on the other hand, is a token that can be used to, as the name implies, it's a token that can be used to request for with the extension of the lifetime of the access token, or to request for a new access token before the entire session expires. So that way the user doesn't have to be logging in frequently, because the refresh token can be used to request for another access token before the current one expires. But that's the normal application access process without conditional access. So what does this look like with conditional access? So this is what that looks like. You have the users using a client. Again, that could be any type of client, and they need to access some application. We have a conditional access policy, which, if you look at it, if you break it down to the simplest term, it's a simple if this, then that policy list. If these conditions match, then apply these controls. So that is what it's about. There are more controls than this. I'll show you some another slide that will go into a lot more details, but this is the basics of it, right? If these conditions apply or if these conditions are matched for this authentication request, then apply these controls. So again, the user uses the client to access the application. Application redirects the user to Entra ID for authentication. Entra ID validates the password, but the request is also sent over to the conditional access engine. And the conditional access engine begins to look or evaluate different attributes of the authentication request. For example, what's the identity of the user that's signing in? What role do they belong to? What groups are they a member of? So we can use that to do things like if a user belongs to this group, then require MFA, or if they are assigned to this role, then require MFA. So you can do things like if a user is assigned to a privileged role in Entra ID, like global administrator, application administrator. For those highly privileged roles, then what I want to do is I want to enforce MFA if a user is trying to access certain applications. We can look at the location that the user is connecting from. What IP address are they connected from? We can even classify those IP address ranges into trusted and untrusted. So maybe there are certain controls that I want to apply if a user is not connecting from a trusted network like over the VPN. Then I want to apply maybe some additional controls. I can use that to look at those attributes of that authentication request before the token is granted. That could be what authentication method are they using. Are they using strong MFA? Are they using what's considered not to be strong MFA? If we have Microsoft Intune, we can look at things like the device compliance. What's the current state of the device that the user is using for the authentication? So that information can feed in from Microsoft Intune. Again, we'll look at that later. So if the condition passes and the control is to allow access, or maybe to allow access but require MFA, or maybe do like limited access. In those cases, then an access token and refresh token will be granted. As we saw previously, will be granted to the user, and then the user can use that access token to access the application. So that's what that looks like. Okay. Now, conditional access has evolved a lot from many years ago. So if you knew conditional access from many years ago, things have changed since then. So here are the components of what makes up conditional access. So these are the components of what makes up conditional access. There are actually 4 main components that makes up conditional access. Component number 1 are the identities or the objects. Now, one of the things that you see here, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is not just about users. This could be groups, and that could be workloads. Yes, conditional access can be applied for workload identities. Conditional access can be applied to service principals in Entra ID. So those are called workload identities. So that's one of the key components of conditional access, the identities or the objects that needs access. The second component of conditional access is what they need to access. That's not just about applications. That's now extended. So I told you earlier, conditional access has evolved a lot. That could be an application. That could be if this identity wants to access this application. That could be an action. If this identity wants to join a device to the domain, if this identity wants to register a MFA device, then here are the conditions that I want to evaluate. Here are the controls that I want to apply. That could be network access. again, with Microsoft SASE solution that was released recently with Microsoft Entra Access. So you can now use conditional access policy with that to say if a user is trying to connect to this network, then here are the controls that I want to apply. That could also be data. And from a data perspective, that's talking about things like data in like your SharePoint site. If a user wants to access data on the SharePoint site, so that's really limited in terms of what's supported. But anyways, I want you to notice that the target goes beyond applications. It can be actions, it can be network, it can be data. So that's second component. Then we have the conditions that we want to evaluate for. So that's the condition that we want to apply our policy to. And you can also see here that that is really, really wide if you have a look at this. So for example, you can see that, let me get a pen and let's zoom in again. You can see that that could be a user risk or sign-in risk. So these two, you can see that I have a star in front of that. So that's actually going to be bringing in signal from identity protection, which we'll talk about later. So it's going to be consuming telemetry or data that's coming from another Entra service, from another Entra ID feature. It's going to be consuming that telemetry to go, what's the risk of this user? What's the user risk? What's the sign-in risk? That could be based on insider risk. So that's going to be consuming data or telemetry from Purview for that condition. That could be the device platform. If a user is connecting from this device platform, it's a Windows device, it's a Linux device, it's a mobile device. Maybe it's based on the device attributes that the user is trying to that the user is trying to use to connect. So, for example, what's the ID of the device? Who owns the device in Entra ID, right? So that could be based on the location, so which actually has been replaced by this new network condition. So that's talking about where is the request originating from. That could be what client application is the user using to send the authentication request. Are they using a browser-based web application that supports modern authentication? Are they using an OAuth confidential client? Are they using a mobile app, a desktop client? Are they using legacy applications that support protocols like, let's say, Exchange Active Sync, SMTP, POP, IMAP, and a greater called legacy authentication client? And you can even do that based on authentication flow. What type of authentication is the user trying to perform, or is the identity trying to perform? Is it trying to perform a device code flow authentication or an authentication transfer flow? We'll talk about those later. So can look at this condition. So that's the third component of conditional access. And then we have the fourth and final component of conditional access, which are the controls that we want to apply. So to keep it in a very simple way, and I'll go through the controls in a minute, to keep it in a very simple way, we have identities that are looking to access something, whether it's application, action, network, and data. We're going to evaluate for certain conditions, and if those conditions match, we're going to apply certain controls. So what are the controls that we can apply? I told you earlier, conditional access has evolved quite a lot. You can see that this is not just about allowing access and blocking access and requiring MFA. Now we have more controls that we can apply. For example, we can require strong MFA. All MFA are not equal. Some MFA are stronger than other MFAs, right? So for example, there's something called phishing resistant MFA. So these are MFA methods that are difficult to phish. So for example, if you're using push notification on your mobile phone as your MFA option, that can be phished. You have attacks like MFA bombing, where attackers keep sending MFA requests to users, and then eventually maybe some users get frustrated, they go ahead and they approve the requests. But then you have MFA methods like, which I have my key here, like your FIDO2 key. Where is my key? Oh, here we go. Like your FIDO2 key. So this is more difficult to fish, right? It's a hardware device that I have to plug into my device in order to authenticate. Or if I'm using something like Windows Hello for Business, where I'm using my fingerprint or I'm using my Face ID to authenticate, that's more resistant to phishing. So we can apply that as a control to say require strong MFA if a user is trying to access a specific application and perform an action, access a network, or access certain data. We can request for password reset. So this one is usually used in conjunction with the user risk condition. So for example, if identity protection has flagged the user as being risky, maybe what I want to do is I want to force the user to reset their password the next time they try to authenticate. I can require device compliance as an action. So again, that's going to be looking at Intune and say before you can access this application, your device needs to be marked as compliant according to the policies that are configured in Microsoft Intune. So there are other things that we can do. We can check that the device is joined to the domain. We can require application protection policy. Again, that's using data if we're using Intune. And for a limited use case, we can apply session policies. So it's called like session controls or session policy. So these ones are only supported for a limited use case. So where we can limit what the user can aspect of an application that the user can access. So again, this is limited to things like SharePoint Online and a few other applications like that. So ladies and gentlemen, those are the 4 components that makes up conditional access. It has evolved a lot since years ago. So let's move on. What are some of the recommended security baseline policies for conditional access? Require MFA for administrators. So that's a baseline policy that you want to configure. That could be even extending that. By the way, this is going to be enforced whether you like it or not. You won't need to configure this policy in the future because that's going to be enforced. So if you're doing anything with Azure management, Microsoft are going to require MFA going forward. So it's something that you need to plan for if you're not already planning for that. But there are other things like maybe if the user is trying to connect from an untrusted network, maybe you want to require MFA. Blocking legacy authentication. Let me get my mouse. Okay, 1 minute. I think PowerPoint is acting up a little bit. So apologies. Just a little bit of acting up by PowerPoint, and let me see if I can. Oh, okay. So apologies. I may need to maybe kill this and restart it. Let's try it again. Okay, yeah, it's working now. Okay, so you can use conditional access again, recommended security baseline, block legacy authentication, require organization managed devices for highly sensitive applications. So for example, maybe you have like a financial application or an application that has access to intellectual property. So you want to configure a conditional access policy to make sure that users can only access such applications if they're using devices that are managed. So they're not using their own personal devices to access those applications. You can use conditional access to enforce that. Require trusted location for MFA device registration. The reason why you want to do this is because, again, to prevent or to guard as another layer of defense against where an attacker register an MFA device for a user, so that they can just do their own MFA without having to even phish any user. So what you want to do is you want to say if a user wants to register a MFA device like Microsoft Authenticator app or their phone numbers, they need to do that from a trusted location, maybe over a VPN network. So that adds another layer of defense. You want to require compliant devices and trusted networks. So essentially, you're combining both of these together for highly sensitive applications. So these are some of the common policies that you may want to apply. Actually, Microsoft has done a great work, which I'll go over to my console now. Microsoft has done a great work with conditional access to where we can actually go to where we configure our policies. So if I go to create new policy from templates, what you see here is that Microsoft actually has certain templates which are classified as under secure foundation. So these are some, so again, which covers some of the policies that I shared with you earlier. So requiring MFA for admins. So you can start with some of these, and then gradually you can sort of like work your way up to your own custom policies in your organization. So you may want to start with the policies defined under secure foundations first. But if you're creating your own policy from scratch, so this is what I was talking about. So conditional access policy 01. And this is what I was talking to you about. So you have like the identities, which I mentioned earlier. Those could be users, they could be groups, but also they can be workload. And I'll show the one for workloads to you in a minute. So you can do conditional access for workload. But this is the place that I can configure conditional access for users and for groups. So I can specify the user or the groups that's going to apply to. So if I apply that to the DevOps team group, and then the targets. So this is what I was talking about. So the targets could be cloud applications. The target could be user actions. For example, if a user wants to register security information, so that's when they want to register their MFA devices. Or it could be if a user wants to register or join the device to a domain, there's certain conditions that I want to evaluate for, and there are certain controls that I want to apply for those sensitive actions. Then that can also be based on authentication context. But as I mentioned to you earlier, that is limited to actions in applications like SharePoint and Microsoft Cloud App Security. So it's not very broad in its application when it comes to authentication context. But in this case, if I say if a user is trying to access a cloud application, so I can go to select specific resources. So I'm just going to select, let's go to Azure. I'll just go to management. Nope. Let's scroll down and let's see. So you have all of these. Oh, by the way, let me just go to close that. So let's scroll down a little bit. So you can see like there are different applications, including your own custom applications that you've registered with Entra ID. You can apply like these controls. Let me apply that to Microsoft Graph command line tools. So if a user wants to use Microsoft Graph command line tools, and this is the other part that I was pointing to you about, is that it can also be based on network, right? So if you can configure that and say if a user is accessing, so evaluate the network. Are they coming in from a trusted network? Or maybe there's specific network address ranges that I want to select. So I can go ahead and I can select this, right? And then the conditions that I want to evaluate for. So I can look at the user risk that's coming from identity protection, sign-in risk, insider risk, which is coming from Microsoft Purview, insider risk. Device platform that they're using Android, Windows, Mac, and all the other stuff. So just be a bit careful with these. Using device platforms for your conditional access policies, because they can be easily bypassed. So just with a single extension in the web browser, I can switch my user agent from showing a Windows device to showing another device, and that's where I bypass any conditional access policy that's based off of that. So just be a bit careful when it comes to relying on these ones too much. So you have like your location where you can um, control, look at the location that the user is connecting from. The client apps, so you can look at the client apps that they're using. Are they using a modern authentication client like a web browser or a mobile or desktop client? Or are they using legacy clients like legacy authentication client, which you should be blocking? Anything that's using legacy authentication client, any authentication request that's using legacy authentication client, you should be blocking them because those clients don't support MFA and attackers can try to use them to bypass MFA controls. You can look at things like device attributes of the device that's connecting. So maybe attribute of the devices, like let's say the device ID, the device name. So for example, you may want to have certain applications that only, let's say, the board of executives can access. You can do that based on their device ID, right? So if it's their device IDs, they can access this application. If it's another ID, they can't access this application. So you can specify all of those. So let's discard that. And there are other things. I mentioned this earlier, authentication flows. And I'll come back to authentication flows later. Authentication flows is one of the ways that we can begin to use conditional access to do some type of token protection. For example, if I configure this, I can say if the user is using a device code flow, or if a user is using an authentication transfer flow, what I want to do is I want to block access. I don't want to grant an access token if a user is trying to use a device code flow or an authentication transfer flow. This is a very interesting one because again, you can see that this is in preview. Why? Why are Microsoft targeting these two authentication flow methods? What's the reason? The reason is because this authentication flow method are commonly abused by attackers in order to perform token theft attacks. Let me give you like an example of that. Let's say the authentication transfer, which is this second option here. What that flow looks like is that it allows users to transfer tokens from one device to another. Think about a scenario like this. A user is signed into Outlook on their PC. Oh, let's get it bigger. A user is signed into Outlook on their PC, or they're signed into an application on their PC. And then maybe they're allowed to scan a QR code. And when they scan a QR code on their mobile phone, we can transfer, they can get an access token on this device without having to authenticate, to go through an authentication process. So this can be exploited by an attacker. So let's say someone is able to get access to that QR code, they scan that QR code, and then they get an access token that they can use to impersonate the user. So these are very, this type of authentication flows are useful for some use cases, but they can also be exploited. So that's the reason why you may want to use conditional access policy to begin to limit where these authentication flows can be used in your environment. The other authentication flow that it mentions here is called the device code flow. Many of you have used the device code flow. If you've ever logged in using the Azure CLI, you're used to the device code flow. So you go to use Azure CLI. Azure CLI gives you a device code and says, go to your web browser and go to this web page. Put in this device code in this web page, authenticate, and when you do that, an access token is going to be delivered to that client application. Now, that is great if you're using Azure CLI, but that can also be exploited by an attacker, right? And again, where an attacker can use that to try to bypass things like MFA. So once they have like a refresh token, they can use that to bypass that. But again, that is for other topics. But what I can do in this case is I can have a policy that says if a user is using a device code flow, they can only use that if they're using a specific type of client, or they can only use that if they are trying to access an application, like let's say an Android application in a meeting room. But they cannot be using that to be accessing a sensitive application, because I know that that could be the sign of an attacker trying to exploit this flow to steal tokens in my environment. So I can see Malcolm has a question. Malcolm says, will the recording be sent out? Good question, Malcolm. So the session is automatically recorded, and you're going to find it on this YouTube channel immediately after the session. So the recording will be here immediately after the session, so you can always come back to it. And thanks for mentioning that. So if you're able to, please do like the video also, and also subscribe to the channel if you're yet to. That will be highly appreciated. So anyways, let's get back to this. So I hope that that makes sense to you in terms of why Microsoft has started adding this in order to control, the type of authentication flow that can be used using conditional access policies. So you can begin to control that. And then we can specify the different controls that we want to apply, which I was sharing with you earlier. So this is not just about allowing access and granting access. I can require authentication strength and say I can require passwordless MFA, or I can require phishing resistant MFA. So that is even much more stronger, right? And I can apply all these other controls that we talked about. And one of the controls that Microsoft recently added, if I go under the session option, because this has to do with token theft again. So if you go under the session option, you see like one of the controls that we can apply is around things like, let's say, the sign-in frequency, but we can also apply this one, require token protection for sign-in sessions. We'll come back to this one later also when we talk about token theft and protecting against token theft attack. So this is conditional access for users and groups. What about if you have workload identities, application identities? How do you apply conditional access policy to workload identities? How do you do that? Well, let's go have a quick look at something. So if I go to here, let's go to under identity, under protection. What I can do is I can go create. So with conditional access policy for workload identity, we can only do location-based conditional access policy. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So let me go try to configure conditional access policy for a workload identity for an application, not for a user or a group, for an application. So I'm on the protection, in the protection aspect now. If I go to configure the custom security attributes, and let's go to, okay. So here's one of the things to keep in mind. If you're going to be using this, you need an additional license that you may need to enable for workload to be able to configure this. So you may, I think that you probably need like the Microsoft Entra Suite in order to be able to configure this. So let me go over to another environment that I have access to and go to do this in that other environment. So let's do this in another environment very quickly. So let's go to Entra Admin Center. So, and I think that is where I'll stop for today. I'll just show you how you do workload identity, conditional access, and then I'll stop here for today. So let's go to under protection. I go to under custom security attributes. So what I've done here is I added like a custom attribute earlier. So I added one, which is for, let's say, Azure DevOps, SCA source control applications. So, and if I go to under policy requirements, so if I go to edit the attribute. So I have certain attributes that I'm defining here. So require MFA, blog guest users, and all the other stuff. So anyways, I define a custom attribute. So let's go to the other steps of configuring this. So once I've got like my custom security attributes defined, and what I can do is I can go to assign that this custom security attribute to an application. So if I go to Entra Admin Center under Identity, if I go to under Application, and under Application, if I go to under Enterprise Applications, if I go to under Manage, and under All Applications, I can get one of my applications. I'll just pick one. Not that one. Let's go to, yeah, let me use this one, David Desktop App. Let's pick that application. Okay, so and let's go to manage custom security attribute, and then what I can do is I can apply that custom security attribute that I created. I can apply that to this application. So once I've done that, then what I can do is if I go back to under protection, under conditional access, and if I go to create a new policy, and in this case, if I go to assignments, so in this case, there is a license that I'm missing. So I'll need to have the Entra ID Suite license, which I do not currently have. So unfortunately, yeah. So I thought I had it in this tenant, but I don't have it in this tenant. I have it on one of my tenants, but just not this one also. So anyways, so maybe I can show that to you another time. But that's where you configure. You need like an additional license if you're going to be able to use that. So actually, let me just bring that up. So conditional access, workload, identity, Entra Suite. So let's go to have a look. So this is showing like the configuration, but from a licensing perspective, there's something that you need to have. So which in this case, you can see that when you create that, you can specify, let's see, 1 minute. Yeah. So, okay. So conditions, you specify your conditions and client apps. So I'll come back to that one. So I think that's like, yeah, so because it's under assignments that you're going to see where it says user workload identities. So I think that there is a license, there's an additional license that you need in order to be able to implement this. So we'll come back to that. So hopefully that makes sense to you in terms of conditional access policy. So just keep in mind the 4 components that I mentioned. If there's anything that I want you to take away from this, it's to keep this in mind. This gives you the full picture of what is possible with conditional access today. So you have your identities, which can be users, groups, or workload identities. You have the targets, which could be applications, actions, network, or data. You have your conditions. We can bring in telemetry from identity protection from Microsoft Purview, or if you're using the new Microsoft Entra Access solution, can also integrate with that. And then you have your controls where you can apply controls ranging from specifying the strength of the MFA all the way to specifying the compliance of the device, all the way to specifying the type of authentication flow that this is going to apply to, which is what I was mentioning to you. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining today's session. So I hope that you got something useful from it. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you next week, where we'll extend the conversation to identity protection, and then we'll talk about token theft, where I'll expand a little bit more on the token theft attacks, and where the other policy that I shared with you earlier where that other policy can help you. And also, I'll share the limitations of that policy. So this policy that I shared with you earlier, um, under conditional access, when I went to create a new policy, I shared a specific session, um, a specific session control, and I mentioned this one. So require token protection for sign-in sessions. So I'll talk about this. I'll talk about identity protection. I'll talk about token thefts. But that'll be next week. Thanks very much again for joining. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, that's it for today, and I'll see you next time. Have a lovely rest of the morning, afternoon, evening, and see you later.